Well, hello, and it's very exciting to be with you. We're live and from the Oxford Centre for Fantasy, and we're going to be talking today about the Second Age and the Amazon Prime series that's based on that material, due to be broadcast next year. Many of you will be watching this on YouTube and on Facebook, but there's also a podcast version of this, which if you want to listen to, you can find it on our website at the Mythmakers Podcast. Right, well, let me introduce the people who are joining me today for this discussion. So first of all, Paula, over to you.
Hi, I'm Paula Calamaris. I'm a fantasy writer and I own a small publishing company. And I've just released a new fantasy novel with my partner, Paul Crayley, called Shadows and Light. And I've been influenced by Tolkien for as long as I can remember.
And also with us is Ty, who has, I think, the most Tolkien-esque name I've ever come across. So, Ty, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I do production as well as distribution internationally, and been a Tolkien fan for my life, pretty much. So looking forward to discussing this stuff.
That's as a movie maker or a filmmaker, as we say over here in Oxford.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'm Julia Golding. I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Fantasy, but I'm also a novelist and a screenwriter, amongst other things. And really, Tolkien was the writer who got me into writing when I was younger. So like Paula and like Ty, absolutely fascinated to see what happens when the Second Age material is taken on for this series. So what we're going to be doing, first of all, is giving you a rough guide to where you can find the material. That's the sources in which you can look up later for the detail. Then we're going to be drawing out the main themes that are available to the screenwriters. And then we're going to have fun working out what they might do with that material, both the challenges and also the riches that they have to uncover. So first of all, let's talk about the sources for the Second Age. So first of all, Paula, where would you go to first if you were looking for Second Age material?
Well, the first place that I always look are in the appendices of The Return of the King, because that gives the story of Arwen, and it gives us and Aragorn, and it gives us the timelines of all of the ages, the rise and fall of Numenor. You find out everything else, and then I go to the Silmarillion. So those are my major points.
So, Ty, where would you go in the Silmarillion? I know that you're a particularly expert on this, because the first thing you told me about yourself was that your introduction to Tolkien was by which book?
Silmarillion, yeah. And it started with The Hobbit, actually, with my mom reading The Hobbit to us when we were kids, and then went to, I hadn't read Lord of the Rings. I actually started with the Silmarillion. And that was really interesting because it's probably the toughest book to start to read, because you got to keep flipping back and forth to the end and trying to figure out who these guys are. But the final part of that book is Akallabeth, which was written by, pretty much brought together by Christopher after Tolkien passed away. And it's where I get pretty much all my information. It describes the lands, who they were, and what finally happened to them. So.
Yeah, and Christopher Tolkien is obviously the son of Tolkien, who died very recently, but he took on the editorial task once his father had passed.
Mm-hmm.
And the final place where, well, I mean, there are probably other places too, but the final sort of main chunks that you can find are ones which are a bit more obscure. They're in a volume called The Unfinished Tales, which, as the title tells you, they are unfinished. They're also sometimes not the final version, in the sense that you might find the same story told slightly differently in, say, the Silmarillion. So they're not like the canonical version, the last version of Second Age material. But that's also got some really fascinating little stories in there, and some longer length tales if you want to look them up. Okay, so that's the main sources. Let's think about the main storylines that you get running through the Second Age. Now, just so you can sort of position yourself, if you're not familiar with Tolkien material, he divided his world up into 4 ages. You've got the First Age, which are the sort of creation story and the early days of the elves. And the big battles there are the Silmarillion. You've got the Second Age, which we're talking about. The Third Age is a very long period, but the end of that is very familiar from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And then the Fourth Age is what happens after, plot spoiler, the ring is destroyed. I think everybody knows that who's watching this podcast. Yeah, hope so. Anyway, so Ty, would you tell us what the main storyline in the Númenórean case is, just in brief?
Yeah, so what happened after the elves battled effectively Satan, which was Morgoth or Melkor, was that the Valar, which were the gods, took pity on man. And so they decided to give them a place away from their trials and troubles and all that, and it was called Númenor. And it's a fascinating story because it's equivalent to like heaven. There's no sickness, long life, but ultimately you do die. But it was the gift of death that was granted to them by God, Ilúvatar. And so it starts out as being this amazing place of bliss, and the story unfolds and it starts getting more interesting as we go along, and we'll get into that later.
Exactly. And that's all in the Akallabeth, which you mentioned from...
Correct. Yeah.
Silmarillion. Paula, there's some really important themes happening over on the sort of more familiar territory of Middle-earth, isn't there?
There sure are. Simultaneous to what's going on in Númenor, you have many Númenóreans and other men over here, and they're mingling with the elves. And the elves are mingling, they're fighting against Sauron, who has taken over from Satan, or Melkor. And he's created a very tense world, and the elves keep fighting against him, but other elves keep leaving. They go to they leave the main kingdoms of Lindon and some of the other places, and they go to a place. They start a place called Eregion, and if you know what Eregion is, it's also something called Holland, which is during the Fellowship of the Ring becomes a place that's dangerous to the Fellowship as they go through, which forces them to go into the mountains, which ultimately forces them to go to some place called Moria. And when they get to Moria, they meet all sorts of dangers. Well, during the Second Age, the dangers are introduced by the dwarves who keep delving down into the mines of Moria, and they wake up something called the Balrog, or Durin's Bane. I can say this, Durin's Bane. And the Balrogs are perverted Maya. So everything that will ultimately become Gandalf or Saruman or the others, or Melian, who is in the Hidden Kingdom, the Maya are one step down from the Valar, and they're here in Middle-earth to, help. But the Balrogs have been perverted by Morgoth and have become evil, and will play a more important part in the Fellowship of the Ring and the transcendence of Gandalf. But at this time, the elves are moving. Our elves are moving into Eregion, and there's an elf named Celebrimbor. And Celebrimbor, or Celebrimbor, is the son of the grandson of one of the great jewel makers or artificers from the First Age, named Fëanor, who created these special jewels. And Ty, if you want to add in about Fëanor from the Akallabeth, go right ahead.
I'm just enjoying your talk. It's all good.
Fëanor created these jewels. They created a lot of hassle for everybody. They're all lost. People died all over the place. And Celebrimbor fought against his father, who was going after the Silmarils, and became a great jewel maker of himself. Well, after they defeat Sauron, he tricks them. He takes on a beautiful form. He calls himself Anator, and he comes and he teaches them how to make these rings of power. And these rings of power are the same rings that have been that are very important in the Third Age. Well, there's a whole poem about rings of power. 9 went to the mortal men, 7 went to the dwarves, and 3 went to the elves. Well, Celebrimbor, Sauron touched all of the rings except the ones for the elves. And then he created the One Ring, which is the whole crux of the Third Age and the Fellowship of the Ring, is he creates this one ring that rules all these other rings, so he can hand out rings, and they seem to work for a while, and they're very nice, and they're very pleasant, and everybody's rich, and they have long lives, and they have all these things. And then eventually greed and cruelty and all of the other things that characterize Sauron come to play, and the men turn into what are eventually called the Nazgul, and the dwarves lock themselves up and keep digging for more and more treasure, and the elves hide the rings. So Sauron never has, even though his one ring can control them, he's never touched them. So that's the secondary line of stories that's going to be going on. If you've got Numenor over here and you've got the rings being created over there, eventually they're going to come together.
Okay, so my role in this, my role in this is to kind of do the rest. So you've got the forging of the rings, the making of the rings, Sauron as the tempter figure happening in Middle-earth. But around Middle-earth, you also have the potential for story themes of characters that we know exist at that time. I'm sure anyone who's read the books can come up with quite a few. Obviously, you've got Treebeard and the Ents are still rocking around at this time. And you've got Tom Bombadil. He's the oldest, so he's definitely there. And what about the others? Well, we know from the very start of Lord of the Rings, I don't know when you pick up Fellowship of the Ring, if you go straight into the story or if you read those introductory elements, but there is a little Hobbit history. And you've got sort of like, not exactly primitive, but early communities of hobbits. He mentions 3 families who are like prototype hobbits. They don't seem to take much part in history, but they are, potentially there. And one thing which I'm really fascinated about is in the Unfinished Tales, there's mention of, I've got to get their names right because it's very similar to another name, the Druedain, as opposed to the Druiden. They are the wild men. And if you remember in The Return of the King, when Rohan is looking for a quick way through to Minas Tirith to join the Battle of Pelennor, they go through a forest and they meet this wild man. So it's a kind of species of man, a bit similar to, say, like the Aboriginal communities in Australia. It's that kind of relationship to the other men around them. And there's a really fascinating series of tales about these men in the Unfinished Tales, including the tantalizing glimpse of the fact that some of them are on Numenor. They are there because they love the one tree that's there. And I think that would be just fascinating. They also have that perspective that they're slightly outside the main run of men. So if you're looking for another perspective on this story, they are potential. And in addition to them, you've also got other men, not Numenorians, but just general run-of-the-mill men and women. And there is a story about Numenor coming in as like, first of all, a friendly power, bringing crafts and agriculture, and then as a colonial oppressor, as the Numenor sort of sours. So you've got another potential colonial story there, which exists. So anyway, these are some of the themes which we've drawn out that cover the Second Age material. We should mention, of course, that it's a hugely long period of time, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Is it about 4,000 years? Something like that, isn't it?
Around 4,000 years, yeah.
Yeah, it's a long period of time. So when you think about our own history, 4,000 years ago, we're talking Egyptians, It's that period of time. There's a lot of potential of difficult to write but fortunately you've got characters who live that long. When you talk about elven characters, for example, and Ents, they obviously have long lives. Okay, so Should we talk about how the themes interact? I've mentioned one way, which is the Numenorian, the idea of them as colonizers coming over and reacting with Middle-earth. But there are other links. It's not as if the creation of the rings happens over here and Numenor over here. There's lots of triangulation that goes on. Where do you see the main connections to make the story of the Second Age basically hold together? Paula, why don't you have
start?
I was waiting for you.
Paula.
I'll go. The interesting thing is you've got Elrond and Elros. One's half elven, the other one chooses the human side. That was one of their offers, which they took upon themselves. One of them said, "Okay, I'll take the houses of the elves." That was Elrond, and that's why you see him through all the ages. The other one was Elros, who was gifted as king Numenor, and so there's this. You never find out in any of Tolkien's writings whether or not they got to talk to each other. It was far before the Palantir, so somebody wrote, "Oh, they would have looked at each other," and they're like, "Back up, guys." They didn't have that. So I think if you followed that narrative, where you've got two brothers that are effectively in different parts of the world. Remember, Rivendell was set up as a refuge. So there was still war. There was still bad stuff going on in Middle-earth. They still had Sauron. Whereas in Numenor, it was long life, no sickness. You're close to the Blessed Realm. You've got, Aule built it up, so it would have been beautiful. Ivana, who was one of the Maiar, she was one of the Valar, blessed it. So it really was, in all aspects, a perfect place. And when the Numenorians went over, it's about 600 whatever, Second Age year, everybody was amazed at their power. And so what does that say about Middle-earth at the time? It was kind of a dark ages. And so it will be very interesting to me how the writers and the producers will put those two together. Because again, it's a long, long period, 4,000 years, and God knows how many characters. It's going to be interesting to see what point of time they're going to address. And to your point, you've got Galadriel that's been around. You've got got pretty much all of the elves are still going to be there that we know in Lord of the Rings, including Glorfindel. So to me, that's going to be the fascinating part, is how do they put these two together, and how do they show, to your point, the Numenorians originally as gift givers? Hey, we want to help you out. We want to build a city. We want to be here for you and protect you, to becoming that power where even Sauron's armies leave and Sauron has to, hey, don't wipe me out, kids. I'm here. And they put, like you said, they put the Middle-earth men or the middlemen in servitude. And that will be really interesting to see how they present that, because you had two groups of people on Numenor. You had those who were adamantly for that, let's go oppress them. And then you had a group called the Faithful, which was totally against that. They were more, let's follow Iluvatar or God, let's treat everybody right. And it's going to be fun to watch how they address that.
And I also think there's going to be a significant amount with the elves, because the elves were, no matter what, the Numenorians were still jealous of the elves. I mean, these guys are immortal, and they've got Maya or Maiar in there, breeding with them, so that by the time you get to down to Arwen, she's got great grandparents who are Maiar, which are one step down from the Valar, and you've got all of the elven ancestry. So you have all of that going on. You have a king like Gil-galad, he's keeping himself to himself, even though he's out trying to protect people. Well, this still causes a great deal of stress amongst all of these people, because you've had the story of Luthien and Beren, and they've captured a Silmaril, and she's given up her elven existence, and that rankles with people a lot, especially with the elves, because their immortality means that they will eventually, even if after they die, their spirits will go to Valar, and they will be there with the gods. Whereas the mortal men will go to the halls of Mandros and have a completely different fate. And men aren't really excited about that concept. I mean, it's like they're going to die and these guys get they go hang out with the gods. And it's a little, there's a certain tension that exists probably at all times. I mean, it goes all the way down to Aragorn. Yeah.
I think Gil-galad is an interesting new character. He does get mentioned in a song in Lord of the Rings. I think Sam sings the song. Yeah, Sam sings the song, which is a good summary of the Gil-galad story. But he is the big, exciting new character on the elf side who has a kingdom, which sounds very much like my favorite chocolate brand, but Linden. And that is, if you look at the maps, it's sort of above where you normally look for the Shire. And it's a kingdom that's both land and sea. So in terms of the potential for the filmmakers, they've got some new landscapes they can explore because they have not really done much about the sea. And because he is in a seafaring kingdom, that gives them a connection to the Númenóreans. And he is actually friendly with one very important king from Númenor. And that friendship means that the Númenórean fleet comes at the right time to save their bacon at some point. So he's a key character, and I'm sure is, because he lives through the whole period, will be one of the uniting sort of threads. Because compared to them, all the men are like mayflies. They live for such a short time. They come and go. Whereas the elf characters are that sort of thread of continuity. So I think that when we're sort of thinking about the challenges, and gosh, there are lots of challenges for these screenwriters. What do you think of the main challenges? We've already mentioned the long spans of time and how you make that connect. What else do you see as challenges for them?
I think just the scope of the story. Now they said they're going to do multiple series. So it may be that, they start with something year one. Remember in Lord of the Rings, the thing that Peter Jackson did was he would start it with kind of a summary about how everything came to be. My guess is they're going to look, I don't think they're going to do a deep dive into everything. I think Tolkien fans will probably be a little bit bummed out because they're not getting into the deep lore. But again, if you get into the deep lore, you're going to lose a huge part of your audience because somebody's going to be saying, I'll go back to Ted Lasso. So for me, it's figuring out, again, who those central characters are. And I would agree with you guys. I think they're probably going to go Elvish, and because they've been around and they can tell stories about, this is how this happened. Because remember, well, I'll bring it up. Akalabeth was originally written as a letter. So it was to somebody, from somebody, and it was about, this is how the downfall of men happened on Númenor. So, it'll be interesting to see if they take it from a linear, a straight point. Here we're going to start and here we're going to end, like Lord of the Rings, or if they're going to go back and forth between things to show past history and how this affected this. So, Al-Farazon and his, he was the last king, and he was the one that challenged the West and said, I'm going to go. And it'll be interesting to see if they start with that, because that'll be a massive, massive, massive piece. And you're going to wonder, what the heck is this all about? So it's going to be fun. I could not imagine being in a writer's room and also be under the restrictions, or the guidance and the restrictions of, the Tolkien family, because you got to think of it. They already said they're going to invent new characters that kind of go along with the story, but they are not allowed to go outside of the storyline. So they've got to stick to it. So to me, it's going to be so interesting to see how they keep that going, because I think, in the Lord of the Rings, there were a few things in there that I think a lot of diehard Tolkien fans, they loved it, but some of the things they weren't too happy about. And to me, it's going to be interesting to see who they aim for. Are they aiming for the Tolkien fan, or are they aiming for the larger audience? And I think they're going to go larger audience.
I agree. I definitely agree that they're going to go larger audience, but I think they're also going to fill in with the obsession that everybody has with elves. I mean, if you look at something like Pinterest or some of these other sites, because I teach a Tolkien class, and so I like to do PowerPoints for people so that they can see things. And you just look for images, and there's like thousands of images of elves in various situations, not necessarily connected to Tolkien, but they're elves, and they're based on, Thranduil and Legolas and all of them. And it's very interesting to see this, even when some of these like Tolkien wikis and all of these other places. So I think they're going to have to take into consideration that there is a huge section of the population that are diehard Tolkien fans, whether it was through the movies or whatever, The Hobbit, which my mom read to me, and, I graduated from Lewis to being handed The Hobbit to reading Lord of the Rings. I mean, that was a progression of my reading as a child. And then she wondered why I was a medieval history major.
Progression.
But so I really think that at this point, they're going to have to integrate both of them. And I was saying to Julia, I thought one of their best ways would be doing it is just as Galadriel tells the story at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Rings, maybe Elrond's telling this story, and he's telling it to Aragorn as Estelle. As a young boy, he's telling him his history without revealing that he is to be the king someday. And I thought that would be an interesting device to use.
Well, the other side is... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say another little sidebar, as you mentioned Thranduil, who's Legolas's father, that he's around. Just another person. Around. Yeah. I think that the problem they have, though, is just the realities of making... Let's think about it now as creatives as opposed to Tolkien nerds. Difficult though that may be. So the films were made for a theatrical audience, family audience. We already know from the gossip coming out of New Zealand, they hired an intimacy coordinator, which is a sign that there will be some, it could be a person-on-person violence, but it often is a sign there's sexual interactions going on, for which they fortunately now have proper, coaching for. But it does suggest adult themes. And I think there's a concern, which I've heard on the sort of discussion when we posted we were doing this, lots of people saying, please don't do a Game of Thrones. They don't want that. The issue is that there is loads of potential for that, particularly in the Númenórean materials, because you've got human sacrifice, forced marriages, which are basically rape by marriage, all sorts of corrupt shenanigans. So you can see how legitimately sticking within the story that they have been allowed to use, that they could go in that direction. I think it would be a massive mistake to take it too mature. I just think it would, if it's not something you can sit down with or maybe teenage kids and watch comfortably, I think that would be really hard. And for me, that would be a failure.
Alluded to without being graphic.
Exactly. In terms of sort of rankings in film rankings, I think it's different in America to over here, but we would say an advisory level or a 15 is how we do it here. And what's the
15? Absolutely
15? If they go above that to the sort of over 18 thing, I think that
they'd lose an audience.
I think there would be a massive lot of unhappy Tolkien fans out there, but maybe I don't know. What do you think about that?
And this is why, we didn't even talk about who another point of view where it would come from would be through Sauron.
Yeah.
Through Anatar, because he is the underlying factor here. After Morgoth or Melkor falls, he's left. He's still in Middle Earth. And so he's building stuff. And when he sees the Numenorians, he's like, okay, I got to build Mordor. So, and then he comes back as Anatar, the gift giver. And he was apparently a pretty good looking guy, because the elves welcomed him in and said, hey, come on in. So for me, I don't feel like they're going to go Game of Thrones, because first of all, Game of Thrones has already been done. The audience is there and they don't want that comparison. The other side of it is, don't forget, the Tolkien estate is behind this. They have the ultimate say in what goes in and what doesn't go in. I think that they would be, I can't speak on their behalf, but if I was thinking about it and thinking the way Tolkien perceived the books, which was, you look at The Hobbit, very kid story, harmless, fun. Then you go into The Lord of the Rings, which was much more, okay, this is the establishment of the Age of Men, and you're going in. The Silmarillion's the darkest of all of them, because it's almost a narrative. It is a narrative. And it is as dark as you're going to get, because you've got the gods going against this. You got, fighting against each other. And you also have something that I find interesting, which is that it's almost as if once the Valar have done their part, they leave. And they leave it up to man to take care of. So for me, the second age is going to be about, the establishment of the kingdom of men, but also what's still happening in Middle Earth. And you can't tell that story without being pretty dark in some places, because that's what it's all about. So, we discussed this earlier about, will there be humor? And, if I'm guessing, and this is all I am doing is guessing, there's probably not going to be a lot of humor in this. It's going to be a epic story with, you talk about visuals, some of the stuff I can't wait to see, the Great Mountain, basically just going through all of Middle Earth during that time too. So, my guess is it's going to be around 15, or what we call PG-13 here, maybe between that and R in some places. Yeah. But, going full on that way, you're going to lose a lot of Tolkien fans. They're going to be going, not for me. I'll read the books.
Well, maybe not just Tolkien fans. People will be looking for family entertainment. The people who went to see the films aren't necessarily Tolkien fans. They just think, oh, here's a good fantasy film. And I think if they turn up and find it's the kind of thing where you want to cover the eyes of your... Actually, in my family, the kids would be embarrassed that I was there. They'd be covering my eyes. Mom, you can't watch this. I think if that's the reaction, it's going to be... It will certainly restrict people who watch it, I think. Whether or not it finds a new audience, that could be the calculation. I can imagine that conversation going on. We need to actually expand this into a new audience.
And again, it's not going to be broadcast. It's going to be specific. So unless you stream it and you don't have that service, you're not going to really see it. And I think that's an interesting way, because that may open them up to doing all sorts of things that I think might be excessive. But then there are, just remembering what happened to Celebrimbor, what Sauron does to him at the end. You all remember that? He's
so the plenty of torture potential.
So that kind of thing, but that's part of the story. That's part of how the evil manifests. And a lot of this is about evil manifesting. It's manifesting in the rings.
I just want to go back to something Ty said, which was about the linking figure of Sauron. Now, as a creative, that's what I would probably be thinking about most, because you have, I don't think they'll do this, but you have the wonderful potential for an anti-hero, the kind of Miltonic Satan figure. You could almost see a really surprising take on this, to be telling it from his point of view, because he is the guy who keeps getting knocked down and gets back up again. The Lucifer figure. They won't do that, of course, but you could see a really fascinating version of this, telling it from that flip side.
It would be it would be an interesting device to have him as part of the narrative. Maybe not
Because
all
if
of
you
it,
think
but
of the season conclusions, let's say if they're doing 4 or 5 seasons, you've got his downfall is really there at each one of those, or his rise back into power. He is the guy who is actually the point at which we get this climax. He is the reason why Numenor is turns into Atlantis and disappears. He is the reason why the rings are created. So he is absolutely key, central. And another thing that Ty mentioned is the lack of potential for the lack of charm and humor. Now, this is where I want to throw my toys out of the pram, because I think the real difference of Tolkien from many other forms of fantasy is that he has this real, dare I say, English sensibility. The hobbits having tea and talking about second breakfasts. There's a sort of earthiness and grounding in there, a charm, which is harder to find in the Silmarillion, but not impossible to find. And if they don't do that, it will just feel like yet another big scale fantasy epic thing, which never actually touches the heart. And I think that's the danger, because the elves aren't us. Who is the perspective that is us? I don't emote with an eternal being. I'm too aware of my frailty and humanity. And you can obviously have human perspectives in it, particularly any underdog figures like the elf friends, the Numenorian elf friends, who are the ones who fall out of favor with the kings as they get more and more corrupt.
I think one of the other ways of having charm is when you think back to the beginning of the Silmarillion and how the world is created. Iluvatar introduces music, and music is very much a part of Elvish tradition and Elvish life, and I'm sure with the Numenorians. And I think if they play upon the music and play upon the poetry and the songs, that could add a lot of charm. Even with some,
I think it would. Well, you see, I think that will add atmosphere and beauty. But would it actually, by charm, I mean, something a bit more relatable?
Well, I think if you're performing it and you're on stage, if you're a performer who's a human doing it for an elf, or as Sam would do a poem or any other thing, you can introduce somebody with a sense of humor or with something more wry than just the grim, okay, we're going to colonize and destroy everyone concept. We can, maybe make.
But don't you think they need banter? So I'm just thinking, like with other what they need is like the Fellowship had banter. And when you think of the success of the Marvel films, the ones that often do the best are the ones where there is banter, even though these are superhuman characters. When there's humor, like the Thor Ragnarok, everybody goes, wow, this is really funny. And suddenly I can relate to the fact that Thor's a god because he's talking about the Hulk being a friend from work. Suddenly it becomes, oh yeah, I can relate to them. I think you don't want everyone sort of speaking at the verily, my lord, I deem that thou art this, that stuff. You want something that's much more...
I would almost imagine that Elros has a better sense of humor than Elrond.
Yeah.
Well, and I was going to get to that. So Elrond does have that sense of humor when, Merry and Pippin are going to go. He's like, well, I guess you're going to go. And then, there is that underlying humor. And I think it is very much the English humor, which is it's great that you're in this meeting, even though you weren't invited. So I think my guess is they're going to find these characters that they can put in there that, provide a little bit of levity, because you have to. I mean, you just can't have oppression, through 6 seasons of, that's got to be tough. So I think finding that underlying, with tragedy, it allows humor to be that much greater. And that's where, that's what some of the best movies that have been out there. I mean, Shawshank Redemption, guy's going through hell, but he still talks a little bit to Red. Why's your name Red? I'm Irish. It's that kind of underlying humor where it can be subtle. We're not going to go, full on whatever, The Office, but although they did do a good Tolkien Office, I will say that. But if you did something like that, where you've got peaks and valleys, you've got those parts where there's a little bit of humor, a little bit of touch in there, so you're giving people that. But you also have the hope element that's going to play huge in the story. It's fighting evil. That's one of the things I love about it. There's definitive evil, and then there's this good, and then there's the middle. And so it's going to be interesting to see how they take that narrative. I agree.
I also think that when you have relationships, and you're going to be having relationships between, elven men or human men and elven women and other things, that they're not going to just be grim sitting around doing nothing. I mean, they're going to, and I'm not talking intimacy. I'm just talking about getting to know each other and banter. And, I would imagine that, there had to be something more than, I just saw her standing there and I fell in love with her. They probably had to talk at some point. So I'm sure that will bring some kind of human touch to some of these.
I mean, that's something else to mention, is that actually in the Second Age, there is loads of women.
Yes.
You've got some really interesting Numenorian women. There's in the Unfinished Tales, there's a really interesting story of a king and his a sort of failed marriage. It's a long study of a failed marriage of one of the Numenorian kings, where he's going off sailing the world, making friendship with Gil-galad and others, which turns out to be key. But from the perspective of the wife left behind, it's kind of like,
hey,
where's my husband gone?
Where are you going?
Yeah,
planning to come back,
and it's
back to Middle Earth.
It's very interestingly written and very nuanced. You could have a whole season of just that. Actually, I don't think they'd do that, but you could.
You could.
And you've obviously got Galadriel in a key position. One of the questions we were sent in is by who asked this? Let me just find. Elizabeth was asking us, what about dwarf women? Because one of the key centers is Moria, as you mentioned. And in the films, you'll remember that there's a brief reference to dwarven women. And in fact, in The Hobbit, Peter Jackson puts them in, the bearded ladies. But you could do a proper dwarf kingdom where you see proper strong dwarf women as well. That would be quite fun.
No, they're cave bodies, but it doesn't mean that they, don't have influence on what goes on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I look, the great thing about Tolkien is he made the women, very strong. And you got that from his Norse influence, I think. And also just, he wanted that feeling that, you're going to have somebody that's not going to just be, oh, poor little me. And, it's amazing how, like with Numenor, we were talking about, there's 3 queens and they were very powerful. One actually relinquished the throne because it was going to be overthrown anyway. And I look at that, and between that and Sauron, and again, you've got Galadriel still out there. You've got quite a few characters that you can start picking on, including, which would be interesting, is we talked about, the eldest, Tom Bombadil. Well, he's got a hell of a sense of humor. So, maybe it's him and Goldberry, dealing with that too. I don't know. It's going to be fun.
I'm not
going to go off on that tangent.
I missed him so much in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, but
I really wanted him there.
Yeah.
The problem is, from a story point of view, is he kind of busts through things. He doesn't behave. He's a bit of a random element, almost a caricature in a sense. He'd be really hard to make convincing. Basically, I think he works on the page and would be hard to work in a film personally. So yeah. We've got some more questions here. Are you ready for the questions? Are you ready for the questions? So Parker asked, do we think that the show is going to be similar in tone to the Peter Jackson movies?
We don't.
You don't? I mean, we've already mentioned the adult themes. I've got a feeling the look is going to be a bit similar. The actual design of it. The one image that we've got that's on if you go to the Amazon Prime site for it, the banner image, if you look very carefully, you can see the white tree of Nimloth in the back. I don't know if anyone's noticed that. It looks like a sunrise, but if you look carefully, you can see branches. So it looks as though it could be Numenor. That is a still from, if that is indeed a tree. But it feels like a potential production design from the Peter Jackson films, I think, with that unreal, not quite rooted landscape of Mediterranean jacked up on some drug style places with lots of white arches and that kind of thing. So I think the tone is going to be similar in look as opposed to material, script.
I think you're right. I think, and when I said, do I think it will be like the Peter Jackson movies, the reason I'm saying no is, first of all, with a series, you've got a lot more you can pace. So you don't have to fit everything in 3 movies, even if they are 3 hours long. The other side of it is, I think, I'm not sure what the rights were that New Line had and all that from Tolkien estate, but it sounds like they weren't as restricted in the storytelling, meaning Peter Jackson wasn't as restricted in his storytelling as they're doing here. So for me, it's going to be, do I think it's like Peter Jackson's? I think it's going to be more straight to the book, more straight to the stories that are in Lost Tales and Silmarillion and the appendix and all that. But I think the visual is going to stay within the continuity of the movies, because they didn't stray from it in The Hobbit. They went through all the movies there. So that's my own personal opinion on it. I hope I'm right, because they did some good jobs on that stuff.
They were striking. And I think I'm sure many of the sets are probably still there. So I think they're going to utilize whatever they have and then supplement it. But I do think that the same visual style is going to be the same. Story-wise?
Yeah. I mean, that visual sort of fantasy world theme seems to be in other fantasy series as well. Just looking at the Wheel of Time trailer, there is a sort of approach that's gone into these high fantasy. That's very, it's hard to imagine them not doing it in a strange kind of way, if they've got the budget. Another question we've been asked is, or wants us to think about. Jake's asked us to talk about Celebrimbor's involvement in the Rings of Power, which you mentioned a little bit, Paula. Sauron and the 9 lords who became Black Riders. And Nancy also asked about this, because she points out the Nazgul, the Black Riders, that 3 of them are lords of Numenor, and the rest
for sure is the Witch King. The Witch King
you've got
is Numenorian.
Yeah, so obviously Numenor disappears in the Second Age. So these characters are going to be potential lesser bad guys, the closest followers, one assumes, of the tempter Sauron. So does anybody have anything they'd like to say about that, sort of what they would do with 9 is a lot of characters, but what would you do with 9 potentially evil lords?
I think Ty has an answer for this.
Okay, Ty, off you go.
So remember, they're not wraiths yet. And that's the thing that I think is fantastic, is that they're described in the books, and I'm paraphrasing, so if the geeks hear this, I'm sorry, but they're described as great sorcerers. And to me, that's going to be pretty cool, because, the Asari they don't come out till in other words, Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, the 2 blues, they don't come out until the Third Age. So you've got this time to build those characters out and, watch them slowly evolve into the emissaries of Sauron. And to me, that's going to be incredible. But it's also the balance of having the dwarves with their rings as well. And eventually, like what we were talking about, everything starts falling apart. So, in one side, you've got the rings of power being built. On the other side, you've got Numenor. And to see the rings of power start to just, bring the downfall of these guys, is going to be pretty cool.
And if they're not all...
Now, that's going to be pretty late in the age.
And some of them are Easterlings. Some of them, excuse me, the second in command to the Witch King has been described as an Easterling. I forget what his name was. He's the only other one named. He's Kahamul or something. And so he's not from the direct line of people. So Sauron reached out.
Oh, yeah.
He reached out. He wasn't just concentrating on the people beneath the Númenóreans in Middle Earth. He was reaching out to others. And that brings in a whole group of other people.
Just as a little sort of sidebar here, we've also had questions about the wizards, and particularly the blue wizards, who are the ones that Gandalf says he can't remember their names. They don't come over, as Ty just said, or at least we think they don't come over until the beginning of the Third Age. But I mean, clearly they are like archangels. They are sort of these Maya figures. So one could possibly say they were around, but I don't think the Tolkien estate would allow that.
There is a Maya. In the Melian.
Yeah,
there are some.
Yes,
here.
They exist. They exist, but the actual wizard version of this are not players yet. They're Third Age characters.
Which is interesting because when you think about it, you've got Fëanor, who devised the Silmarillions. He was a student of Aule. You have Sauron, who before he fell was also a disciple of Aule. And then you have, who raised up Númenor, who established Númenor, was Ossë, who was basically a Maya guy, lifted up. But it was, again, Aule did that. And then basically Aule is responsible for all the problems of the elves and men, really, when you get down to it.
I agree.
I think that's a real revelation. Aule did it.
Yeah.
That's the answer to the mystery.
So there you go.
There you go. It's all his.
So here's a couple of quick fire things just to wrap up here. If you were rung up and they said, "Hey, we got problems with the script. Would you like to come over and fix it?" Would you take that gig?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely. No question.
I imagine they
give me a ticket. I'm on my way. I'll bring my cat.
The writer's room must be full of people banging their head against the wall, though, just trying to square this circle.
I couldn't even imagine. Yeah. I mean, it's hard enough doing a Hallmark script. I can't imagine doing the entire Silmarillion. Sorry, little plug there.
I got a lot of beer from Brie. So,
really, I mean, you think about Lord of the Rings. That's a narrative, and it still took them. I don't even know how many times they went through it. Now you've got something that's going to encompass 4,000 years. Wow,
and I still keep wondering, how is that going to be structured? That's the thing that really is fascinating me, is how are they going to structure it? How are they going to bring the continuity? How are they going to interweave all of these stories? You got immortal elves versus mortal men, like you said, mayflies.
Yeah.
So the next quick fire question is the other side of the camera. If you were going to be cast as a character, who would you pick? I'm just going to say that there is a cast list of headshots on the Amazon Prime site. And it's quite a fun game, which I did with my boys, which is to go through trying to guess who everybody was going to be. Elf, dwarf, man, Númenórean. It's quite fun to see if you can guess. Looking at it, the one face I recognise who's really famous in the UK is Lenny Henry, who's a really well-known actor comedian over here. Very, very like Sir Lenny Henry. He's one of our acting nobility over here. Can't work out who he is. Absolutely fascinating. Elros, he would be, he can't have a minor role. So you look at these people, you think, oh, who on earth can you be? So that's quite fun. But let's imagine that for some reason you got the call and they decided to cast you. Who would you like to be told that you are playing? What's the meaty role?
Boy, that's Tar Palantir. I don't know. That's going to be.
Tar Palantir is
that's a real tough question.
Yeah. King. I want to be Sauron. That's the one I'd like.
I was just thinking the same thing.
Because the Wicked Charmer. Definitely want to be the Wicked Charmer. I mean, he's
a pretty interesting cat. And the thing is, he comes as something of beauty, and then he goes in spirit, and then he becomes the Eye. So he's got multiple forms there, so you could play with the character a bit. But boy, that's a tough question.
Yeah, I know.
Elrond, maybe?
I don't think I'm not first on their list for that part for many, many reasons, including the fact I can't act and I'm the wrong gender. But there we go. That would be in this imaginary world. That's the one. Perhaps they could put me in one of those cap suits.
It doesn't be female. How do you know,
Paula? What about you? What would you go for?
I've thought about this a lot of times because every time I read something else, I want to play that person. But I've always, this is very presumptuous of me, but I always thought I would be good as Melian.
Oh, right. You fancy yourself as a Maya?
Sure, why not?
I think another really good female part would be is it Tarmiriel, the last tragic
that
last
was the
queen.
Other part I was thinking about is Tarmiriel, Melian. What I she goes through so much too.
Yeah,
it's hard.
I hope all of you who are watching this are having your own little thought experiment here of casting yourself in this, and maybe some of you even are in extras or whatever and having great fun. I think it's going to be amazing. I really wish the production team well on this. I hope that you really succeed. We're here to support you and stand in awe of the task that you have in front of you. We wish you really well with it.
A pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who are watching, if you want to keep in touch with our future live streams, do go to our website. There's lots of things happening on our website, including some fantasy writer courses and in-person courses in Oxford, because the whole point of the Oxford Centre for Fantasy is to remember where this writer came from, where Tolkien came from, the city that inspired him, as well as his friends C.S. Lewis and others. So that's what we're about. But it's great to see that his influence has spread all over the globe, and it's such fun to share it with you all. So thank you so much for staying with us and for watching. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.